The machine beside the bed made a sound like breathing, which was more than Micah Cole could say for himself most nights. In, out, in, out. A rhythm borrowed and returned, over and over, because his own lungs had stopped being reliable around the same time as everything else. 3 months, the last doctor had said, and then, because doctors always felt the need to soften a number that couldn't be softened, he'd added, give or take. Micah had laughed at that. Give or take what? A week? A day? The doctor hadn't liked the laugh. Nobody ever did. People wanted you to cry when they told you these things, because crying made them feel like they'd delivered the news correctly, like they'd done their job. Micah just wanted to know how many hours he had left where his hands would still work well enough to hold a controller. That was the arithmetic that mattered to him now, not days, hours of hands. He turned his head against the pillow, carefully, because everything hurt in a low, grinding way that painkillers only muffled instead of silencing, and looked at the laptop propped on the wheeled tray table beside the bed. Its fan was louder than it used to be, straining a little, like it too was running on borrowed time. On the screen, a loading bar crawled toward full. The banner had been sitting at the top of the launcher for 2 weeks now, blinking gently, patiently, the way a nurse might remind you of an appointment you had no intention of missing. 11 years the game had run, 11 years of expansions and patches, and a player base that had shrunk from hundreds of thousands to a few thousand diehards, and now, finally, the publisher had decided it wasn't worth keeping the servers lit for a few thousand people who still logged in every night to walk through a dying world. Micah understood that kind of math better than anyone. He'd found Ashfall Requiem 9 years ago, back when he was 15 and friendless and better at killing time than making friends. It wasn't the biggest game or the prettiest one. What had kept him coming back long after every other game he'd loved had been abandoned for something newer, was a story that never stopped being sad in interesting ways. A world called the Marrow, built on the bones of an age that had ended in something the lore books only ever called the Hollowing, and never explained. There was a legend, half buried in item flavor text, in NPC barks nobody bothered to listen to, in a handful of achievement descriptions that made no sense out of context. A king who had unmade the first age of the world, not through war, not through conquest, but through something quieter and worse, the Hollow King. Nobody knew what he'd actually done, because the quest line that was supposed to explain it, a raid-tier storyline called The Last Regency, had been announced 4 years ago, teased for 2, and then quietly, permanently shelved when the studio's budget dried up. They'd left half of it in the game files anyway, broken, inaccessible through normal means. A ghost quest that triggered under conditions nobody had ever fully mapped, that dumped you into an empty instance with placeholder dialogue and unfinished geometry, that ended, if it ended at all, in a black loading screen that just sat there, forever, because there was nothing built on the other side of it. Micah had triggered it exactly once, 2 years ago, by accident, doing something stupid with a glitched item duplication in an abandoned zone. He'd stood in that broken half-built throne room for 11 minutes before the game crashed. He'd spent the 2 years since trying to get back in. Tonight was his last chance. In 3 days there would be no server to trigger anything on. His hands didn't shake as badly as they had that morning. Small mercy. He propped himself up another inch, wincing at the pull in his side, and typed his password into the login screen, with fingers that felt like they belonged to someone else. Someone older. Someone who hadn't spent the last 6 months learning the particular geography of a hospital ceiling. He'd built the character the way he built everything in his life that he actually had control over. Deliberately, carefully, with an eye toward efficiency instead of vanity. In a game that let you pick advantages, he'd picked 2. A talent called Ashen Vision, which let you see through illusions and lies other players couldn't detect, and one called Hollow Kin, a joke of a passive nobody else took because it was flavored as a curse. Reduced healing received, permanently, in exchange for a damage bonus that scaled the lower your health dropped. He remembered picking it and thinking, with the particular dark humor of someone who'd just gotten his first diagnosis that year, sure, why not build the character who's already dying too? The world loaded in around him. The Marrow, in its last days, server population down to the low hundreds, most zones empty, the ambient music looping without anyone left to appreciate it. He didn't bother with the main quest hub. He went straight for the coordinates he'd bookmarked 2 years ago, out past the edge of a zone the developers had clearly abandoned mid-construction, where the terrain glitched into unrendered black past a certain point, and the game's usual boundary warnings had simply never been finished. It took him 40 minutes of trial and error, cross-referencing a Discord thread from 3 years ago that 11 other obsessive players had contributed to before giving up. 40 minutes of his remaining hours of hands, spent walking a dead man's character through the seams of a dying game, looking for a door that wasn't supposed to open again. On the 41st minute, it opened. The throne room was exactly as broken as he remembered. Half the pillars had no textures, just gray placeholder boxes. The throne itself sat at the far end on a dais that dropped off into nothing, an unfinished floor with the checkerboard pattern of a texture that had never loaded, as if the room was standing at the very edge of everything the developers had bothered to build. He'd seen that message before. He walked forward anyway, because what else was there to do? Because his character's boots made no sound on the broken floor, and the silence of it felt, weirdly, like company. Something new this time. A shape at the base of the throne that hadn't been there 2 years ago. A patch of the game's engine had clearly touched this instance at some point in the intervening time. Some maintenance script running through content nobody would ever see, and it had left behind, almost by accident, a single object. A crown. Not equipped, not sitting on the throne, just lying on its side on the broken floor, rendered in the low-poly placeholder style of an asset that had never received its final pass. When he walked close enough, a tooltip flickered into existence. Micah looked at that prompt for a long time. Long enough that the nurse checking on him through the cracked door assumed he'd fallen asleep with the laptop open again and quietly closed it a little further. Not enough to wake him, not enough to end the session either. Small mercies, everywhere, if you knew where to look. He didn't know what would happen. That was the whole point, wasn't it? He'd spent 9 years in a world that was ending, chasing the one piece of its story nobody had ever been allowed to finish, because somewhere in the last 6 months it had become the only ending he had any control over at all. The doctors couldn't tell him how his story ended. Nobody could. But this broken, unfinished, abandoned thing, he could at least try to see through to the end, even if the end was just a crash, even if the end was nothing. He clicked use. The screen didn't crash. The screen went white, not black, not the loading screen he remembered from 2 years ago, but a clean, featureless white, and text began scrolling across it in a font the game had never used before. White on white, barely readable except where his eyes had adjusted to the glare. His chest hurt. That wasn't new. His chest had hurt for months. But this was a different kind of hurt. Sharper, localized, spreading out from somewhere behind his sternum, like a hand closing slowly around something it had finally found. The monitor beside his bed, the one that made the sound like breathing, changed its rhythm, began to alarm. Micah Cole did not hear it. He was watching white text scroll across a white screen, in a hospital room, 3 days before a game he loved would stop existing, and the last coherent thought he had, in the only body he'd ever owned, was not fear. It was something almost like relief. Let it finish, he thought. Just let it finish, this once. Let something I started actually finish. The white filled everything. He woke up warm. That was the first wrong thing, the thing that told him, before he opened his eyes, before he understood anything else, that something had gone very differently than he expected. He hadn't been warm in months. The hospital kept its temperature clinical and low, and even under 3 blankets his hands had stayed cold enough that the nurses commented on his circulation like it was a puzzle worth solving. Now there was warmth pressing against his skin from every direction. Sunlight, he realized slowly, actual sunlight, falling across sheets that smelled of something clean and floral instead of antiseptic. He opened his eyes. The ceiling above him was not the water-stained hospital ceiling he'd spent 6 months memorizing. It was carved wood, dark and old, worked into a pattern of interlocking branches that a small, distant part of his brain, the part that had spent 9 years reading fantasy game lore for fun, recognized immediately as ornamental, the kind of ceiling that belonged to someone with money. He tried to sit up and his body obeyed too easily. No grinding pain in his side. No 15-second delay between deciding to move and his muscles agreeing to. He sat bolt upright in one smooth motion that would have taken him a full minute and left him breathless. 6 months ago, in his old body, and the wrongness of that, the sheer physical wrongness of feeling strong, hit him harder than anything else in the room. He looked down at his hands. They were smaller, younger, The knuckles that had swollen with the particular ache of his illness were smooth, unmarked. A child's hands or close to it. 13, maybe 14 years old, if he had to guess from the proportions. And on the inside of his left wrist, where there had never been anything before except a hospital bracelet with his name misspelled on it, there was a mark. Black, vein-thin, branching out from a central point in a pattern that looked, disturbingly, like the crack pattern of shattering glass frozen mid-spread, permanently inked into skin that had never asked for it. It didn't hurt, it didn't itch, it simply was, the way a scar is, except he had no memory of ever earning it. Somewhere in the room, a door opened. Still asleep, my lord asked me to check the moment the voice cut off. Micah looked up to find a woman in servant's dress frozen in the doorway. A tray in her hands, her eyes fixed not on his face but on his wrist, on the mark he hadn't yet had time to hide, and her face had gone the particular gray-white of someone who has just seen something they'd been trained, from childhood to fear. The tray hit the floor. Porcelain and silverware and something that might have been breakfast scattered across polished wood, and the woman didn't even flinch at the crash. She was already backing out of the doorway, already screaming a name, not his, some name he didn't recognize, down a hallway he'd never seen, in a house he didn't know, in a body that was and wasn't his own. Micah, Kalen, some quiet certainty in the back of his skull corrected, unbidden, the way you know your own name without having to think about it, sat very still in a stranger's bed, in a stranger's body, and watched the mark on his wrist catch the morning light. He didn't know what world this was. He didn't know what the mark meant, though the shape of it, that fracturing, spreading black, pulled at something in his memory he couldn't quite place, some half-buried recognition from 9 years of reading item tooltips and lore fragments in a game that no longer existed anywhere except inside his own skull. He knew one thing, with a certainty that settled into his new chest like a stone dropping into still water. He was not the hero of wherever this was. Whatever that mark meant to the servant who had just fled screaming through the halls, it was not a mark of blessing, or favor, or destiny in the way stories usually meant that word. It was the mark of something people ran from. Something people feared enough to drop a tray and scream a name that wasn't his, without even stopping to check if he was awake, if he was frightened, if he was, as far as they knew, just a child. Down the hall, he could hear footsteps now, many of them, fast, and beneath the footsteps, a voice, low and controlled in the particular way of someone forcing calm over something close to panic. Kalen Corvain, because that was who he was now. He understood that much, even if he understood nothing else. Looked down at his own trembling 13-year-old hands, at the black mark spreading like a crack across glass on the inside of his wrist, and thought about the last thing he'd read on a white screen before everything went dark. He almost laughed. It came out instead as something closer to a breath, shaky and disbelieving, because 9 years of theory crafting and a broken final quest line nobody had ever finished had apparently deposited him, dying, hopeful, half a world away from anyone who'd ever miss him, directly into the one part of Ashfall Requiem's story that had never been written. The part where the Hollow King wasn't a boss fight or a legend on a loading screen. The part where he had a face, a family, a body that could bleed. The footsteps stopped outside the door. He had time to think, with the particular clarity that comes right before everything changes forever, that whatever came through that door next was going to decide the rest of whatever life he had left, and that unlike the last one, this time, nobody had written the ending yet. The door opened. The man who walked through the door was not what Micah, Kalen, he corrected himself again. He was going to have to get faster at that. Expected. No armor, no drawn sword, none of the theatrical menace he'd half-braced for after the servant's scream. Just a tall man in a dark blue coat, gray threading through black hair at the temples, with the kind of stillness that Kalen recognized immediately, because he'd spent 9 years reading character writing and knew exactly what kind of person moved like that. The kind who had learned, a long time ago, that panic was a luxury other people got to have. The man's eyes went to the wrist first. Not the face. The wrist, where the black mark sat exposed against the sheets, and something crossed his expression too fast to name before it smoothed back into that careful stillness. He closed the door behind him himself, quietly, with his own hand, and Kalen understood without being told that this was a conversation the man did not want servants overhearing. "You're awake," the man said. His voice was low, controlled, the voice of someone used to being obeyed without needing to raise it. "Do you know who I am?" Kalen's mind reached for the answer and found nothing. No memory, no borrowed instinct, nothing but the bone-deep certainty of his own name and the strange floating knowledge of a world he'd only ever read about in fragments. He shook his head, and something in the man's shoulders shifted at that, a fractional easing that might have been relief or might have been something worse. "You don't remember me." Not a question. The man crossed the room and sat, uninvited, in the chair beside the bed, close enough that Kalen could see the exhaustion carved into the lines around his eyes. The exhaustion of someone who had been awake a very long time, waiting for this exact moment. "That's not unusual. After a fever like the one you had, the healer said it might take your memory with it. Do you remember your name, Kalen?" It came out steady, which surprised him. "Kalen Corvain." "Good." The man exhaled, slow, like a man setting down something heavy. "I am your father, Damon Corvain, Duke of the Ashmere March. You are my only living son." Only living. Kalen filed that away, the way he'd learned to file away every scrap of information the game's broken lore had ever given him. Carefully, without reaction, because reaction was information too, and he had no idea yet who was safe to give it to. He said nothing, waited, watched Damon Corvain's eyes drift helplessly back down to the mark on his wrist. "You've had that since birth," Damon said finally. "We kept it hidden. Sleeves, gloves, a physician sworn to silence on pain of his family's ruin. 13 years, Kalen. 13 years, and not one servant outside this house ever laid eyes on it." His jaw worked. Until this morning, apparently, when it decided to spread. Spread. That word landed wrong. Kalen looked down at the mark, the fractured black lines branching from a central point on his wrist, and tried to remember if it had looked different before, and found, with a cold drop in his stomach, that he had no before to compare it to. This body's memories weren't his. He didn't know what normal looked like for it. How much did it spread, he asked, because it seemed like the safest question, the one least likely to reveal how little he actually knew. Damon's eyes narrowed slightly. Not suspicion, not yet, but the careful attention of a man recalibrating his read on someone. "You don't remember that either." It wasn't a question, but Kalen answered it anyway. "No. It used to stop at your wrist." Damon's voice had gone very quiet. "This morning it had reached your collarbone by the time the healer got to you. Another inch and it would have touched your throat." He leaned forward, and for the first time Kalen saw something underneath the careful control. Not just exhaustion, but fear, old and deep and worn smooth from years of carrying it in silence. "The physicians who mapped this curse when you were an infant told me one thing clearly, and only one thing. When the hollow mark reaches the throat, the child dies. Not from illness, not from any wound. The heart simply stops, as if something reaches in and closes a hand around it." The room went very still. Kalen thought about a hospital monitor changing its rhythm behind him, 3 days before a server shut down forever, and a chest that had hurt in a way that felt like something finally, deliberately, closing around what it had been looking for. He thought, "I know exactly what that feels like. I did that, last night. In another body, in another world, I felt exactly that." He said nothing. There was no way to say any of it that didn't sound insane, and insane, in a body marked with a curse everyone in this house had spent 13 years hiding, was a very dangerous thing to sound. "So it should have killed you last night," Damon continued, watching his son's face with an intensity Kalen didn't fully understand yet. "The healer's exact words, you should not have woken this morning, and instead you woke, and the mark had retreated. Wrist to collarbone and back to the wrist alone, in the space of a single night, which no physician in this march has ever recorded happening. Not once. Not in 30 years of watching this curse in our bloodline." Kalen understood, then, with the particular clarity of someone assembling a puzzle from pieces that didn't quite belong to the same picture, that something had genuinely changed inside this body last night. Something had come very close to finishing what the mark was built to do, and then, at the exact moment a dying man on the other side of a broken quest line had let a white screen swallow him whole, it had stopped. Not a random landing, a trade. Something in him had taken the place of something that was already dying, right at the threshold of its own ending, and the collision of the two had bought both of them, him and whatever this body's original occupant had been, a little more time neither had earned yet. "I don't know why it stopped," Kalen said, and that, at least, was completely true. Damon studied him for a long moment, Then, slowly, he reached into his coat and drew out a small book, leather-bound and old enough that the spine had cracked in 3 places, and set it on the bed between them without opening it. "Your grandmother kept records," he said. "Every physician who ever examined this bloodline's curse, going back 4 generations. Most of it is nonsense. Desperate men writing down desperate theories to justify their fees. But there's a pattern in it, if you read closely enough. One no physician in this house has ever wanted to say aloud." He tapped the cover once, and didn't open it. Every recorded case of the hollow mark reaching the throat. Every single one, 4 generations back. It always happened at night. It always happened during sleep, and the survivors, the very, very few, always woke the next morning with no memory of their own childhood before that night. He let that sit in the air between them. "I don't think you're my son who fell asleep last night, Kalen," Damon said quietly. "I think my son died in that bed, exactly as the physicians warned he would. And I think something else woke up in his place." His hand closed over the book, not opening it. Not offering it either. Just holding it. The way you hold something you're not yet sure you're ready to give away. "I need you to tell me what you are. And I need you to understand that whatever you say next decides whether I burn this book, hide you somewhere no one will ever look, and pray this house survives what's coming, or whether I put a knife through your throat myself, tonight, before the mark finishes what it started, and takes something far worse than my son's life with it." Kalen looked at his father's face, a stranger's face, worn thin with 13 years of a secret he'd apparently carried alone, and understood that this was the single most important choice he'd made, since a white screen had swallowed a dying man in a hospital bed. Lie, and risk a knife tonight if the lie unraveled. Tell the truth, and risk a knife tonight regardless, because the truth was a boy from another world had died believing this was the ending to a video game. He thought about 9 years of reading lore fragments nobody else had bothered to piece together. About a talent called Ashen Vision that let you see through illusions other people couldn't detect. A talent he'd picked for a character, in a game, that had apparently followed him here in some form he didn't yet understand, because when he looked at his father's face now, he could see, faintly, the shape of the lie underneath the fear. Damon Corvain was not asking what Kalen was because he intended to kill him tonight. He was asking because some part of him, some part buried under 13 years of dread, was hoping, desperately, for a reason not to. "I'm not going to lie to you," Kalen said slowly, choosing each word the way he'd once chosen character talents, weighing risk against permanence. "But I need you to understand that the truth is going to sound insane, and I need you to hear all of it before you decide anything." Something flickered across Damon's face, surprise maybe, at being addressed like an equal by a boy who was supposed to be 13 years old and freshly woken from a night that should have killed him. "I'm listening," he said. And Kalen, who had spent 9 years of his old life mapping a story nobody else had cared enough to finish, who had died reading the last line of a broken quest that promised no authored ending, who had woken in a body cursed with the same mark he'd once studied as nothing but flavor text on a screen, began, carefully, to tell his father the truth. Not all of it, not yet, but enough. Enough to buy himself a night he hadn't been promised, in a world that hadn't finished deciding what he was for. Kalen told his father 3 true things and let him assume the rest. He told him he remembered a world that wasn't this one, a place where the things happening here were only a story, told by people who had never finished telling it. He told him the mark on his wrist matched something from that story, a figure called the Hollow King, though he didn't yet know if that made him the thing itself or only something that shared its shape. And he told him, because it seemed important that his father understand the shape of the danger clearly, that whatever knowledge he had of what was coming was incomplete, that the story had ended mid-sentence, in the world it came from, and he had no guarantee the missing pieces wouldn't be the ones that mattered most. He did not tell him about hospitals or diagnoses, or a game called Ashfall Requiem. There was no version of that explanation that survived contact with a man holding a leather-bound book of his family's darkest secret. Some truths didn't need saying to be useful. He'd learned that much from 13 years of a body that wasn't his, in the handful of hours he'd worn it. Damon Corvain listened to all of it without interrupting once. When Kalen finished, his father sat very still for a long moment, turning the old book over in his hands without opening it, and then said, in a voice gone rough at the edges, 4 generations of physicians never gave me an answer half as coherent as a boy who claims to have died and come back wearing my son's face. A short, humorless breath that might have been a laugh in a kinder moment. God's help this house. I believe you. That was the easy part, Kalen would come to understand. Belief, once his father decided to extend it, turned out to be simpler than what came after. Because believing your 13-year-old son had been replaced by something from beyond the world's edge did not, in itself, solve the problem of the 7 other people in the household who had already seen the mark spread to his collarbone, or the physician sworn to silence who had watched it happen, or the silver compact chapter house 4 days' ride from Ashmere March, whose entire founding purpose, for 300 years, had been finding exactly this kind of mark and burning whatever wore it before it could finish whatever it had started. "The maid who found you this morning?" Damon said, standing, already moving toward the window with the particular restlessness of a man doing arithmetic he didn't like the answer to. "Sella. She's been with this house since before you were born. Loyal but frightened people talk to priests, and priests talk to the compact, and I cannot silence a scream that's already echoed down 3 corridors before I woke to hear it. How long do we have? If she's already spoken to someone outside this house, hours. If we're fortunate, and she went first to the head housekeeper as protocol demands, we might have until tomorrow." Damon didn't turn from the window. "The compact keeps a watcher in every March capital in the kingdom. If word reaches Verance today, a rider could be at our gates within the week." A week. Kalen turned that number over, testing its weight against the fragments of lore he actually remembered, and found, with the particular frustration of a puzzle missing half its pieces, that his knowledge of the Silver Compact was almost entirely second-hand. Ashfall Requiem's writers had built the Compact as flavor for 100 side quests, an ever-present threat referenced constantly and explored almost never, because the story that would have explained why they existed, what the Hollowing had actually done to deserve 3 centuries of organized zealotry built around preventing its return, was the exact story that had never been finished. He knew their reputation, he knew their methods, in broad strokes, inquisitors who could detect the mark even through concealment, a hierarchy built around absolute conviction, a founding doctrine that treated mercy toward anything hollow-touched as its own kind of heresy. He did not know their weaknesses, because the game had never needed him to fight one. He did not know what, specifically, they would do to a 13-year-old boy in a duke's household, because no side quest had ever gone that far before the servers shut down. He was, for the first time since waking in this body, genuinely afraid. Not the abstract fear of a bad situation, but the specific fear of a man who has just realized his map runs out exactly where the danger begins. "I need you to tell me everything you do know," Damon said, turning back from the window as if he'd read the shape of that fear off his son's face. "Not for my comfort, for strategy. If a compact inquisitor rides through that gate in a week's time, I need to know what we're facing before they're standing in my hall," so Kalen told him. Everything the game had ever let slip about the compact. Their founder, a woman named Seraphine Vell whose statue stood in every chapter house. Their signature weapon, silvered blades that reacted visibly to hollow-marked skin, glowing faint and cold the closer they came. Their absolute doctrinal refusal to negotiate once a mark was confirmed. He told him about the one piece of lore he actually trusted, because it had come from an NPC quest giver rather than a loading screen tooltip, and quest givers, in his experience, tended to be more reliable than flavor text. The Compact's founding charter contained a single, narrow exception. A hollow-marked individual who could prove, through a formal rite of contest, that the mark had not yet been claimed, that whatever force it belonged to had not yet taken hold of the person carrying it, could be spared, not pardoned. Watched, for the rest of their life, by a bonded inquisitor, sworn to end them the instant the mark spread again, but spared. "A right," Damon repeated slowly. "You're certain of this?" "Not certain," Kalen admitted. "I told you, the story I know it from was never finished. This is the part I'm most confident is real, because I heard it from 3 different sources instead of one loading screen. But I don't know the details of the rite itself. I don't know what it costs, or what happens if you fail it." His father was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had gone flat and careful in a way Kalen was already learning to recognize, the voice of a man setting aside fear in favor of planning, because fear, unmanaged, made mistakes, and planning, however imperfect, at least gave you something to hold on to. Then we prepare for a rite we don't fully understand, against an order with 3 centuries of doctrine we can't fully anticipate. with a week of time we may not actually have. He looked at his son, really looked at him, in a way that suggested he was, for the first time, seeing not a frightened child but something closer to what Kalen actually was. A strategist wearing a boy's body, working with half a map and no time to draw the rest of it. Is that an accurate summary? Yes. Good. Something shifted in Damon's expression. Not relief, not quite, but the particular grim satisfaction of a man who had spent 13 years dreading a threat with no shape at all, finally being handed one small enough to plan against. Then we have work to do, and very little time to do it in. Get dressed. I'm summoning Sir Ronan. Sir Ronan Ash turned out to be younger than Kalen expected. 30, maybe, with the kind of scarring along one forearm that suggested a career built on surviving things rather than avoiding them, and eyes that went to the wrist mark within a second of entering the room and then, deliberately, didn't return to it again for the rest of the conversation. Small mercy. Kalen filed it away as the first genuinely useful piece of information he'd gathered about the man. Whatever Ronan thought of the mark, he was disciplined enough not to let it show twice. "My lord," Ronan said to Damon, with a bow that was correct without being deferential. "You said this was urgent." "It is." Damon gestured at Kalen without preamble. "My son needs a sword arm he can trust completely, starting today, and I need to know you're capable of not asking questions you won't like the answers to." Ronan's gaze flicked, once, to the wrist, and then, to Kalen's genuine surprise, to his face, searching it with an intensity that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with something closer to calculation. "The boy who couldn't hold a training sword for more than a minute 3 days ago," he said slowly, "is the one you want me guarding with my life." "Yes." "Then something's changed." "Everything's changed," Damon said, and something in his voice made it clear this was not a conversation he intended to elaborate on further. "Will you do it, or won't you?" Ronan was quiet for a moment, studying Kalen with an expression that had shifted, somewhere in the last 30 seconds, from wary calculation into something Kalen didn't have a name for yet. Not quite respect, not quite curiosity, something adjacent to both. "I swore my blade to this house before I ever met the boy," Ronan said finally. "I don't intend to start picking and choosing which parts of that oath I keep." He looked at Kalen directly for the first time since entering the room. "Whatever's changed, my lord, I hope it's changed for the better, because if the compact's coming, as your face is telling me they are, I'd rather guard something worth guarding than a frightened child who can't hold a sword." Kalen looked back at him and thought, with the particular clarity of a man who had spent 9 years reading character writing for fun, that this was exactly the kind of loyalty a story like this needed and almost never got to keep. Earned before the stakes were clear. Offered without knowing yet what it would cost. "I intend to be worth guarding," Kalen said, and meant it in a way that surprised him. Something that might have been the beginning of a smile crossed Ronan's face before he caught it and smoothed it back into professional neutrality. "Then we'd better start today, my lord. If a right's coming, half-trained won't be good enough." Outside the window, the sun had climbed higher over Ashmere March, indifferent to all of it. To the mark on a boy's wrist, to a rider who might already be 4 days out and closing, to a story with no authored ending that 3 people in this room had just quietly agreed to start writing anyway, one desperate decision at a time. Kalen Corvain, dead in one world, reborn into the exact story he'd spent 9 years failing to finish reading, flexed his newly strong hands, felt the mark sit cold and quiet against his wrist, and thought, okay, a week. That's actually not much time at all. He got out of bed anyway. Ronan Ash was, Kalen discovered within the first hour, a considerably better teacher than any tutorial screen the game had ever bothered writing. Again, Ronan said, for what might have been the 40th time that morning, and Kalen reset his stance in the practice yard with arms that had stopped shaking an hour ago, only because they'd gone past shaking into something closer to numb refusal. The wooden sword felt heavier now than it had at dawn, which made no sense given that it hadn't changed weight. Only he had. 13 years of unfamiliar muscle slowly discovering exactly how little of what it knew came from actual practice, and how much had simply been inherited, dormant, waiting for someone to wake it up properly. That was the strange discovery of the morning, the one Kalen hadn't expected and didn't entirely understand yet. His body, Kalen's body, the boy who had supposedly died in his sleep and left something else wearing his face, remembered things Micah Cole never had. Small things, The correct grip on a practice blade came to his hand without thought, even though his conscious mind was fumbling through footwork like someone learning to walk again. A stance corrected itself half a second before Ronan opened his mouth to correct it. It was as if some quiet, wordless portion of the boy who used to live here hadn't left at all, had simply gone still, folded itself into muscle memory too deep to argue with, and was now, cautiously, teaching the stranger wearing its skin how to survive. Kalen didn't say any of that out loud. He wasn't sure yet what it meant, and some instincts, some of them apparently borrowed, told him this was not information to hand out freely. Not even to Ronan, not even after a morning that had gone from stranger to ally faster than he'd had any right to expect. "Your footwork's better than it has any business being for a first day," Ronan said, circling him slowly, sword loose at his side in a way that Kalen was beginning to recognize as deliberate, not laziness, but the specific economy of someone who'd learned, the hard way, exactly how much effort any given moment actually required. "Your father said you couldn't hold a blade 3 days ago." "I couldn't. And now you can block a strike you should have no business seeing coming." Ronan's eyes narrowed slightly, not with suspicion exactly, but with the focused attention of a man cataloging something he didn't yet have a framework for. "That story you told my lord this morning, I wasn't in the room for it, but I heard the shape of it secondhand. Something from beyond the world's edge, wearing the young master's face." A pause, waited. "Does that something happen to already know how to fight?" "No," Kalen said honestly. "I've never held a sword in my life. Not the life I remember, anyway." "Then explain the block." Kalen looked down at his own hands, smaller than the hands he remembered owning, but steadier now than they'd been an hour ago, and gave the only answer he actually trusted. "I don't think all of him left. Whatever's wrong with me, whatever this mark actually is, I don't think it replaced your young master. I think it's sharing him with me. His body remembers things I don't. I think, some of the time, it's teaching me." Something shifted in Ronan's expression. Not relief exactly, but something adjacent to it. The particular loosening of a man who has just been handed a version of events he can actually live with. "That's either the strangest thing I've heard all year," he said slowly, "or the first genuinely hopeful thing anyone's told me since your father summoned me this morning, looking like the sky was about to fall on this house. Might be both, might be." Ronan raised his sword again, settling back into stance. Again. And this time, let's see if he remembers how to attack, not just defend. The rider came on the 4th day, not the 7th, and the difference between those two numbers turned out to matter more than Kalen had accounted for. He was in the practice yard when the horn sounded from the gatehouse. 3 short blasts, the pattern Ronan had drilled into him that morning, as the signal for an unrecognized approach, and the sword in his hand suddenly felt very small and very wooden, and very much not the kind of weapon anyone brought to meet the silver compact. "That's not the pattern for an ordinary visitor," Ronan said, already moving toward the wall, already scanning the road beyond the gate with the flat, assessing calm of a man who had clearly done this before. Single rider, fast approach, not fleeing anything, deliberate speed. His jaw tightened. Compact colors. My lord was wrong about the timeline. Kalen followed him to the wall and looked out at the road himself, and found, with a specific cold drop in his stomach, that he could see the rider clearly even from this distance. A figure in pale gray, silver catching the afternoon light at wrist and collar, moving with the kind of unhurried confidence that belonged to someone who had never once, in their entire career, needed to worry about arriving somewhere too soon. "One rider," Kalen said slowly, working through it the way he'd worked through every fragment of broken lore since waking in this body. Carefully, testing each piece against what little he actually knew. Not a company. Not an armed escort. "Scouts ride alone," Ronan said. "Confirmation before commitment. If they suspected something worth burning a house down for, they'd have sent a full chapter detachment, not a single inquisitor." "So this is a test," Ronan finished grimly. Someone talked. "The compact doesn't waste a solo rider's time on rumor. This is confirmation duty. They already believe there's something here worth confirming. All that's left to decide is whether you survive the confirming." Kalen thought about the maid, Sella, and the scream that had echoed down 3 corridors that morning, and understood, with the particular clarity of hindsight, that 4 days had apparently been more than enough time for a frightened servant's story to travel exactly as far as it needed to. Behind them, the practice yard door opened, and Damon Corvain came through it, already dressed for a formal audience rather than a morning at home, his face set into the careful, controlled mask Kalen was starting to recognize as his father's version of genuine fear. "They're early," Damon said, unnecessary but somehow still important to say aloud. One rider, Ronan reported. "Confirmation, not commitment." "That's not the mercy it sounds like." Damon's eyes went to Kalen, and something in them had gone very still, very focused. The look of a man doing arithmetic he'd hoped to have more time to finish. "A solo Inquisitor confirms one thing today, Kalen, whether the mark exists as reported. If they confirm it, and they will, the moment they lay eyes on your wrist, the report leaves with them tonight, and a full detachment arrives within the week. We won't get a second chance to control what happens after that." "Then we don't let them confirm anything they can act on," Kalen said, and the words came out of him faster than he expected, drawn up from some combination of 9 years of game knowledge and a morning's worth of instinct he hadn't fully learned to distinguish from Kalen Corvain's own dormant memory. "You told me about the right of contest. If a full detachment coming later is inevitable once they confirm the mark exists. You want to invoke the right now," Damon said slowly, "against a single scout, before the chapter house even knows enough to send a proper Inquisitor to preside over it." "I want to control which version of this story they carry back with them," Kalen said. "A scout who confirms a mark and rides home to report it. That's a story about a threat. A scout who witnesses a formal rite of contest, invoked openly, in front of witnesses, by a house with nothing to hide. That's a different story entirely. Even if I don't fully understand the rite's rules yet, even if I could fail it." He looked at his father and found, underneath the fear on both their faces, something that felt almost like the shape of a plan. "I'd rather fail something on my own terms than let someone else decide the terms without me in the room." Damon studied him for a long moment, long enough that Kalen could hear, faintly, the sound of hooves growing closer beyond the wall. The specific unhurried rhythm of someone who had never once needed to hurry toward anything in their life. "Your mother," Damon said finally, quietly, "used to say something very similar, before she died. That the worst thing you could do in a losing position was let someone else finish writing it for you." Something moved behind his eyes. Grief, old and carefully managed. The kind that had learned long ago how to coexist with duty without ever quite healing. "I don't know if that's wisdom or recklessness, coming from a boy who's worn this house's name for 4 days. Maybe it's both," Kalen said, echoing Ronan without quite meaning to. His father's mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile, but stood close enough to one to matter. "Ronan, ready the hall for a formal reception. If my son intends to invoke a 3-century-old rite against a compact scout with no proper Inquisitor present to preside, we are, at the very least, going to make certain he does it looking like he has every right to." "My lord!" Ronan was already moving, already calling instructions toward the house, and beneath the urgency in his voice Kalen caught something else, a thread of something that sounded almost like anticipation, the particular energy of a man who had spent a career guarding things that never got the chance to fight back. Kalen looked out once more at the approaching rider, pale gray, silver-catching light, unhurried in a way that spoke of absolute confidence in an outcome they hadn't yet earned, and felt, underneath the fear that was entirely reasonable given the circumstances, something else stirring too. Something that had been quiet since a white screen swallowed a dying man whole and deposited him into a story with no authored ending. Not confidence exactly. He didn't have nearly enough information to justify confidence, but something adjacent to it. The particular stubborn refusal to let an ending get written without him in the room to argue about the terms. He turned from the wall and followed his father toward the house. 13 years old and 4 days into a body that wasn't entirely his own, carrying a curse he didn't fully understand, into a rite he'd only ever heard about secondhand, against an order he had no complete map of, and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he was not afraid of the not knowing anymore, not the way he had been that first morning. He'd spent 9 years in one dying body learning to live with unfinished stories. This was just the first one that might actually let him help write the ending. The hall of House Corvain had not been dressed for a formal audience in years, and it showed in the small ways, a banner rehung slightly crooked, dust disturbed in patterns that suggested haste rather than ceremony. But Kalen understood, standing at the base of the dais in clothes too formal for a boy his age, that the imperfection didn't matter nearly as much as the intention behind it. His father stood at his right hand, not seated, not above him on any raised chair, but standing beside his son at the same level, in front of the entire assembled household. A deliberate choice. A message, aimed at whoever walked through those doors next. Whatever you came to confirm, you will not find us hiding from it. The scout was announced by a servant whose voice shook only slightly, and Kalen watched the doors open on a woman who looked nothing like the villain his 9 years of game reading had half prepared him to expect. No armor beyond the pale gray traveling coat, no weapon drawn, though he could see the silvered hilt of something sheathed at her hip, exactly as the lore had promised. She was younger than his father, older than Ronan, with the kind of face that had learned early to reveal nothing it didn't choose to. Duke Corvain, her voice carried easily across the hall, pitched for an audience rather than a private conversation. I am Inquisitor Ren Dassel, riding under the seal of the Varence Chapter House. I believe you already understand why I've come. I do, Damon said, matching her formality precisely. And I would rather we not waste either of our time pretending otherwise. My son bears a mark. I do not deny it, and I will not insult your intelligence by trying. Something flickered across Ren Dassel's careful expression. Not surprise exactly, but the particular recalibration of someone who had expected denial, and instead received something considerably more dangerous to argue against. Honesty, offered freely, on the house's own terms. That is unusually direct, she said slowly. I've found directness tends to save everyone involved a great deal of unnecessary grief. Damon's hand rested briefly on Kalen's shoulder, not protective in a way that suggested weakness, but present, grounding, the physical statement of a father who intended to stand exactly where he was standing, regardless of what came next. My son wishes to invoke the right of contest, Inquisitor. Formally, before witnesses, of his own free choice. The hall went very quiet. Ren Dassel's eyes moved to Kalen for the first time since entering the room, and he felt the weight of that attention land on him like something physical, assessing, cataloging, the specific focus of someone whose entire career depended on reading exactly what stood in front of her correctly. Do you understand what you're asking for, child? She said, and there was something underneath the formal coldness of her voice that might have been genuine curiosity, or might have been the practiced warmth of someone who had learned that gentleness extracted better information than threats did. The right of contest is not a formality. It is not survivable by luck, or by charm, or by whatever courage brought you to make this offer today. Most who invoke it die within it. I understand that I'd rather choose my own ending than have one written for me by a report you carry back to Varence tonight, Kalen said, and heard, distantly, his own voice come out steadier than he'd expected. I understand the mark exists. I understand it frightens people, and I understand why. What I don't accept is that fear alone should be enough to decide what happens to me before anyone's actually looked. Something shifted in Ren Dassel's expression, not softening exactly, but a kind of attention that hadn't been there a moment before. The specific focus of someone recalculating an assumption mid-conversation. You speak like someone considerably older than you appear to be, she said slowly. I've had a strange few days. A pause, waited, while she studied him with an intensity that made the mark on his wrist feel suddenly very exposed, despite the sleeve covering it. The rite requires a presiding inquisitor of full chapter rank, she said finally. I hold scout rank only. I am not authorized to preside over a formal contest. Then authorize yourself, Kalen said, before he'd fully finished thinking through the words, driven by some combination of instinct and the particular stubbornness of a man who had already died once and found the experience considerably less final than expected. Or ride back to Varence tonight and report that House Corvain refused nothing, hid nothing, and offered a formal right to the first Inquisitor who arrived, and that the Inquisitor herself was the one who declined to see it through. The hall held its breath. Kalen understood, distantly, that he had just gambled everything on a piece of lore he only half trusted, extracted from side quest dialogue in a game that had never been designed to matter this much. The specific detail that compact doctrine treated refusal to test a genuine offer as its own kind of institutional failure, a black mark against whichever Inquisitor's report reflected it. He didn't know if that detail was accurate. He didn't know if it applied to scouts as cleanly as it applied to full Inquisitors. He had built an entire gambit on a fragment of dialogue he'd half remembered from a broken game 9 years deep in his own dead past, and there was no way to know, until this exact moment, whether the ground he was standing on was solid or entirely imaginary. Ren Dassel's jaw tightened, and then, slowly, She reached to her hip and drew the silvered blade Kalen had noticed earlier. Not raised, not threatening, simply drawn and held loosely, point down, in the particular ceremonial posture that even his incomplete knowledge recognized from half-remembered flavor text. "You've done your research," she said quietly, and there was something almost like respect buried under the wariness in her voice. "Very well. I will preside, under provisional authority, with the understanding that the chapter house may overturn any outcome I certify today, if they judge my authority to have been improperly claimed." Her eyes swept the hall once, taking in the assembled household, the careful staging of the moment. "You understand the terms of the rite itself?" Kalen understood, from what fragments he'd gathered, that this was the exact question he'd been dreading since the horn first sounded at the gate, because the terms, in every version of the lore he'd ever pieced together, had never been fully spelled out. He had walked into this hall with half a plan and a great deal of faith in a story that had never finished telling itself. "Tell me," he said, and hoped his voice didn't betray how much of this he was learning in real time. "The blade responds to what it touches," Ren Dassel said, holding the silvered sword up between them, its surface catching the hall's torchlight in a way that seemed, subtly, to shift and cool the nearer it came to Kalen's covered wrist. "If the mark has been claimed, if whatever force it belongs to has taken true hold of you, the silver will burn white, and burning white, it kills. Painlessly, I am told, though I have never been able to confirm that from either side of the exchange." A pause, grim. "If the mark exists but remains unclaimed, if whatever wears it is still, in whatever sense that word means for something like you, still itself, the silver will only glow, cold and faint, and the rite concludes with your life, and my chapter's official recognition of you as a watched individual for the remainder of it." Watched. Kalen remembered that word from his own explanation to his father, days ago, a piece of lore he'd been reasonably confident about. Some part of him settled, slightly, at hearing it confirmed from the source, rather than his own half-remembered assumptions. "And if I'm wrong about what I am," Kalen said quietly, "if I don't actually know myself which one of those I turn out to be." Something in Ren Dassel's expression shifted, not quite sympathy, but something adjacent to it, the specific recognition of someone who had clearly presided over enough of these to understand exactly how rare honest uncertainty was in the room with her. "Then we're both about to find out at the same time," she said. "Give me your wrist, Kalen Corvain, and let's see which story is true." Kalen stepped forward, and behind him he heard his father's breath catch. Not loud enough to be a sound exactly, just the specific absence of air that happens when someone is holding an entire held breath's worth of fear in their chest. Ronan had positioned himself near the dais steps, close enough to intervene if intervention became possible, though both of them understood, unspoken, that if the blade burned white, there would be nothing left to intervene on behalf of. He held out his arm. Ren Dassel folded back the sleeve herself, with the careful, clinical precision of someone who had done this before and understood exactly how much gentleness the moment required despite its stakes, and the black mark caught the torchlight. Fractured, branching, exactly as it had looked that first morning, unchanged in the days since despite everything that had happened in the meantime. She raised the silvered blade. Kalen thought, in the half-second before the metal touched skin, about a hospital room and a white screen and a message that had promised no authored ending, defaulting to nearest valid instance, and understood, with sudden and complete clarity, that this was the moment the game had never let him see. This was the ending that had been cut from Ashfall Requiem before anyone ever got to witness it, the raid content shelved and abandoned and left broken in the game's own unfinished files, and he was standing inside it now, for real, with real stakes, with a real blade an inch from a real wrist that could genuinely, finally, actually end. He didn't know which way it would go. That was, he realized, almost the entire point. 9 years of theory crafting a story that never finished telling itself, and here, at last, was a piece of it he'd have to write for real, with no walkthrough, no wiki, no broken loading screen to fall back on if the answer turned out to be the wrong one. The blade touched skin. For one endless second, nothing happened at all. No glow, no burn, no verdict of any kind, just cold metal against a mark that had spent 13 years hidden under sleeves and secrecy, and Kalen understood, in that suspended silence, that even the woman holding the blade had no more certainty than he did about what came next. And then, slowly, the silver began to glow. Not white, cold, and faint, and blue at the edges the way frost catches morning light, The color, Kalen understood distantly, watching his own wrist with something between terror and disbelief, that Ren Dassel had described as the mark of something unclaimed. Something that still, in whatever sense the word applied to a boy who had died in one world and woken cursed in another, remained itself. The hall exhaled as one. Ren Dassel lowered the blade slowly, her own expression unreadable, though something in the set of her shoulders had eased in a way that hadn't been there a moment before. "Unclaimed," she said, and her voice carried clearly across the silent hall. "By the authority provisionally granted to me under Compact Charter, and pending full chapter review, I certify Kalen Corvain a watched individual, bound to report any change in his condition to the nearest chapter house, for as long as he draws breath." She sheathed the blade. Somewhere behind Kalen, he heard his father's carefully controlled breath finally break, just slightly, into something that might have been the beginning of relief. "Watched," Kalen repeated quietly, testing the word, understanding, with the particular clarity that comes from surviving something you had genuinely no guarantee of surviving, that this was not an ending. It was, at best, a single chapter closing, one small piece of a much larger story finally, provisionally, safely written. "Watched," Ren Dassel confirmed, and something in her eyes, as she looked at him now, had shifted permanently from the wariness she'd walked in with. "Which means, Kalen Corvain, that I will be riding back through this march a great deal more often than either of us might like, for the rest of your very long, very carefully observed life." A pause, and something that might, almost, have been the ghost of dry humor. "I'd suggest you spend that life proving the silver right." Kalen looked past her, out through the hall's high windows, at a sky that had gone gold with late afternoon light over a march he'd known for exactly 4 days, in a body that carried both his own dying memories and the dormant instincts of a boy who died before him to make room, and thought about a game with no finished ending, and a story he had, against every reasonable expectation, just been handed the pen to finish writing himself. "I intend to," he said, and meant it more completely than he'd meant almost anything in either of his lives. Behind him, his father's hand found his shoulder again, steadier this time, no longer bracing for grief, but simply present, the way a father's hand is meant to be, and for the first time since a white screen had swallowed him whole, Kalen Corvain let himself believe, just slightly, that whatever came next might actually be his to decide. 3 months passed, and the mark on Kalen's wrist did not spread again. He measured the time the way he'd once measured hours of hands in a hospital bed, carefully, gratefully, aware that every quiet week was a gift he hadn't been promised twice. Ronan's training had moved past wooden swords into steel, and Kalen's borrowed instincts had kept surfacing at odd moments, teaching him things his conscious mind hadn't earned yet, until the line between what Micah Cole remembered and what Kalen Corvain's body simply knew had blurred into something he no longer bothered separating. He was, increasingly, both of them at once. That had stopped frightening him somewhere around the 6th week. The letter from the Varence chapter house arrived on a gray morning in early autumn, carried by a courier who refused to sit down until Damon Corvain had signed for it personally. Kalen watched his father break the wax seal at the breakfast table, watched his expression tighten as he read, and felt his own chest go cold in the particular way it had learned to do whenever official correspondence entered this house. "They've upheld the right," Damon said finally, setting the letter down with visible relief. "Inquisitor Dassel's certification stands. You remain watched, under formal chapter jurisdiction, subject to review every 3 years or upon any change in the mark's behavior." He looked up. "It's not freedom, but it's not a knife at your throat either, and after this summer, I'll take it." Kalen let out a breath he hadn't fully realized he was holding. 3 years? It felt, after 4 months of living hour to hour, almost absurdly generous. "There's a second matter," Damon added, more carefully. "A postscript, added in a different hand. Someone outside the compact has petitioned the chapter house for access to you, formally, through proper channels, citing scholarly interest rather than doctrinal concern. The chapter approved it, provisionally, on the condition that any findings be shared with them as well." He slid the letter across the table. "A woman named Illyria Voss, independent archivist, apparently well-regarded, unaffiliated with any order. She's requesting to visit within the month." Kalen read the name twice, and found, underneath his caution, something that felt almost like anticipation. 9 years of piecing together broken lore from a dead game, and here was someone in this world who had apparently spent a career doing the same work from the other direction, chasing the true history behind a legend everyone else had reduced to fear and doctrine. "I want to meet her," he said. Illyria Voss arrived on a wet afternoon 3 weeks later, travel-worn and unbothered by it, with 2 chests of books that took 4 servants to unload, and a manner that suggested she had long ago stopped caring whether anyone found her intense focus unsettling. She was younger than Kaelin expected, closer to Ronan's age than his father's, with ink permanently staining the side of her writing hand, and the specific restless energy of someone who had spent most of her adult life chasing a single obsession. "You're smaller than the rumors suggested," she said, by way of greeting, studying Kaelin across the study his father had grudgingly cleared for her use. "Everyone in Varence is calling you the boy who talked an Inquisitor into presiding over her own contest against protocol. I expected someone taller." "I get that a lot," Kaelin said, which wasn't remotely true, but seemed like the kind of thing that might make her laugh, and it did. A short, surprised bark of a sound that suggested she hadn't expected to be amused this early into the conversation. "Good, you'll need a sense of humor for what I'm about to tell you." She dropped into the chair across from him without waiting for invitation, already pulling a worn journal from her coat. "I've spent 11 years studying the Hollowing, Lord Corvain. Not the doctrine version the Compact teaches its recruits, the actual historical record. What little of it survives in archives most people have forgotten exist. I petitioned for access to you because you're the first confirmed, unclaimed mark-bearer in 3 generations, and I have questions no living scholar has ever had the chance to ask one before. I have questions too," Kaelin said carefully, "about what the Hollowing actually was. I'm not sure the version I know is accurate." Something sharpened in Illyria's expression, genuine, focused interest, the look of someone who had just realized the conversation was going to go somewhere considerably more interesting than she'd planned for. "What version do you know?" Kaelin hesitated, weighing, as he had weighed everything since that first morning, how much truth this particular room could hold. "A story," he said finally, "from somewhere far from here. In it, the Hollow King was a figure who ended the First Age. Not through war, the story implied, but through something else. Something the story never got to explain, because it was never finished being told." Illyria went very still. "Never finished," she repeated slowly. "That's an unusual way to describe a legend." "It's an unusual legend." Kaelin met her eyes. "What does your version say?" Illyria was quiet for a long moment, flipping through her journal with the particular reverence of someone handling something they'd spent years earning the right to hold. "The doctrine version, the one the Compact teaches, says the Hollow King unmade the First Age out of malice. A being of pure destruction who very nearly ended the world entirely, stopped only by the sacrifice of the first Compact founders." She looked up. "I don't believe that version. I've spent 11 years finding records the Compact never wanted anyone to find, and every genuine primary source I've located tells a different story." "What story?" "That the first Hollow King wasn't trying to end the age at all." Illyria's voice had gone quiet, careful, the tone of someone finally saying something she'd carried alone for a very long time. "The records I've found, fragmentary, damaged, half of them written in a court cipher I spent 4 years learning to read, suggest the First Age was already dying. Some kind of slow, systemic failure in the world's own foundations, something no one alive at the time understood well enough to stop. And the Hollow King's mark wasn't a curse chosen by something malicious. It was a containment, a way of gathering the failure into a single point, a single bearer, so that the rest of the world could survive what was coming." She closed the journal slowly. "The doctrine calls it destruction. My reading of the actual record calls it something closer to a sacrifice that went wrong. Or right, depending on how you measure right against the cost of a single life." Kaelin sat with that for a long moment, feeling something shift in his chest that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with a specific, cold recognition. A way of gathering the failure into a single point, so the rest of the world could survive. He thought about a dying man in a hospital bed, choosing to spend his last hours finishing a story instead of grieving one, and a mark that had reached his throat the very first night before retreating, as if something in this body had already been carrying a slow failure of its own, long before he arrived to share it. "You think the mark isn't a threat," he said slowly. "You think it's a container, for something." "I think," Illyria said carefully, "that no one has ever actually asked what it's containing. because everyone's been too busy being afraid of the container itself to wonder about the contents. She leaned forward, and for the first time since walking into the room, something like genuine urgency entered her voice. I need you to understand something, Kaylin. Every unclaimed mark-bearer in recorded history, every single one who survived the rite of contest and lived, as you have, eventually experienced the same pattern. The mark stays quiet for months, sometimes years, and then, without exception, it begins to spread again. Slowly, at first. Always in response to the same trigger, as far as I've been able to determine from what fragmentary records exist. Kaylin's stomach went cold. What trigger? Illyria hesitated, and for the first time since she'd sat down, Kaylin saw something that looked almost like reluctance cross her face. The specific hesitation of someone who has spent years gathering an answer and has never yet had to say it aloud to the person it would matter most to. Proximity, she said finally. To a place called the Sundered Choir, a ruin roughly 9 days' ride northeast of here, where every historical record agrees the original hollowing began. Every previous mark-bearer who ever traveled within a certain distance of it experienced accelerated spreading. Most of them died within the month. She met his eyes directly. I came here to study you, Lord Corvain. But 3 weeks before I arrived, a courier from that region reported the first confirmed monster incursions from the Sundered Choir's wards in over 40 years. Something out there is waking up, and I think, given everything I've just told you, we both already suspect why the timing might not be a coincidence. Outside the study window, the autumn rain had picked up, drumming steady against old glass, and Kaylin looked down at his own covered wrist, quiet, for 4 months now, unclaimed and unspread, and felt the particular, familiar chill of a story he had thought was finished quietly announcing that it had only ever been getting started. How long, he asked slowly, before the mark starts spreading again, if proximity is the trigger, and I've never gone anywhere near it? Illyria closed her journal and did not immediately answer. That, she said finally, is the other reason I petitioned to come here so quickly, Lord Corvain. Every previous case in the historical record, every unclaimed bearer who survived the rite and then lived in quiet isolation, nowhere near the choir at all. Every single one of them still, eventually, began to spread. Slower without proximity. But never stopped entirely. She looked at him with an expression that held more sympathy than he'd expected from a scholar who'd only just met him. I don't think distance saves you, Kaylin. I think it only buys time. And I think, given what's apparently stirring at the choir right now, that whatever time you have left just became considerably shorter than either of us would like. The argument in Damon Corvain's study lasted 3 hours, and Kaylin understood, listening to it, that he was watching his father lose a fight he'd already decided he had to lose before it started. I will not send my son toward the one place in the kingdom that's killed every mark-bearer who's ever gone near it, Damon said, for perhaps the 5th time, pacing in front of a hearth that had burned down to embers hours ago. Scholar Voss, I appreciate your candor, but I fail to see how walking directly into the trigger is meaningfully different from simply waiting for the mark to spread on its own. Because waiting means it happens on nobody's terms but the mark's, Illyria said, unflinching, from the chair she'd occupied for the entire argument without once raising her voice. And going means it happens with allies present, with knowledge gathered in advance, with at least the chance of understanding what's actually happening before it happens to him instead of after. She glanced at Kaylin. I've spent 11 years studying this from libraries and second-hand accounts, my lord. I have never once had the chance to study it from beside someone who's living through it. That's not scholarly curiosity talking anymore. That's the only realistic path I can see toward finding something that might actually help him. He's 13 years old. He invoked a formal right against a compact inquisitor 4 months ago and won, Ronan said quietly, from where he'd been standing near the door for most of the argument, mostly silent, watching. It was the first thing he'd said since the discussion began, and something in his tone made both Damon and Illyria turn to look at him. My lord, I understand you're afraid. I've been afraid since the horn sounded at that gate, but I've spent 4 months training the boy myself, and I can tell you plainly, he's not the same child who couldn't hold a wooden sword last spring. Whatever's sharing his body with whatever came before, it's not going to be well served by us wrapping him in wool and hoping the mark forgets he exists. Damon's jaw tightened, and for a long moment nobody spoke, the only sound the settling of embers in the hearth and the distant patter of rain against old glass. I'm going with him, Damon said finally, and it wasn't a question, wasn't offered for debate. If my son rides toward the sundered choir, he does not ride there without me. My lord, your duties to the march can be delegated for 3 weeks, Sir Ronan, and will be. Damon's voice had gone hard in the particular way Kaelin had learned meant the argument was actually over now, regardless of how much longer anyone kept talking. I have already failed to protect one child from this mark once, 13 years ago, by hiding him behind silence and gloves and hoping the problem would simply never surface. I am not going to compound that failure by hiding a second time, whatever shape my son currently wears. He looked at Kaelin directly for the first time in several minutes. If you're doing this, you're doing it with your father beside you. That much at least, I'm not willing to negotiate away. Kaelin looked back at him and felt something in his chest that he hadn't fully expected to feel. Not from a man he'd known for only 4 months. Not from a father who technically belonged to a boy who might, in some sense, no longer exist. Gratitude, sharp and unexpected, and underneath it, something that felt uncomfortably close to love. "Thank you," he said quietly, and meant it more than the words could carry. They left 8 days later, once Illyria's letters of introduction to the border wardens had been secured and Ronan had finished assembling a small, deliberately unremarkable escort. 6 armed retainers instead of a full company, chosen specifically not to announce the party's importance to anyone watching the roads. 9 days' ride northeast, Illyria had said, and the first 3 passed uneventfully, the road climbing steadily out of Ashmere March's cultivated lowlands into wilder country, forests going darker and older with every mile, villages growing sparser until they stopped appearing entirely. It was on the 4th night, camped at the edge of what Illyria called the Ash Fringe, a border zone where the land itself seemed to remember something the maps had stopped recording generations ago, that Kaelin's mark first stirred. He woke to the sensation before he understood what had woken him, a faint, cold pressure against his wrist. Not painful exactly, but present in a way it hadn't been in 4 quiet months, like a held breath finally being let out. He sat up in the darkness of his tent and pulled back his sleeve to find the black lines of the mark shifted. Not spread, not yet, but reoriented somehow, the fractures reforming into a pattern that pointed, unmistakably, in one direction, north, toward wherever the sundered choir actually stood, closer now than it had been that morning. "You felt it too," Illyria's voice came from just outside the tent flap, quiet, unsurprised. He found her sitting by the dying fire when he emerged, journal open on her knees, not writing, just watching the flames with the particular stillness of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment for longer than she'd admitted to anyone. "How did you know?" "I didn't. I hoped." She closed the journal. Every prior account describes the same thing, the mark orienting toward the choir before it begins spreading in earnest, sometimes days in advance. It's why I believe it's a containment rather than a curse. A curse doesn't need to know which direction its source lies in. A container does, if it's ever meant to find its way back. Kaelin sat across the fire from her, pulling his sleeve back down over the reoriented mark, and found himself asking the question he'd been circling since that first conversation in his father's study, weeks ago. If you're right, if it's a container, not a curse, what happens if it actually gets back to wherever it's containing something from? Illyria was quiet for a long moment, and when she finally answered, her voice had gone careful in a way that told him she'd thought about this question a great deal longer than he had. "I don't know," she admitted. "No prior bearer has ever survived long enough to find out. Everyone who traveled this close to the choir either died from accelerated spreading before they arrived, or," she hesitated, or arrived and was never recorded again at all. No death certified, no body recovered. Simply gone. From every record I've been able to find, as if the moment of arrival was where their story stopped being written down entirely." She met his eyes across the firelight. "I don't say that to frighten you, Kaelin. I say it because you deserve to know, honestly, that I'm bringing you towards something I genuinely cannot promise you'll survive, and that if you wanted to turn back tomorrow, I would understand completely and support the decision without a single word of argument." Kaelin thought about a white screen and a message that had never authored an ending, about 9 years spent chasing a story that refused to finish itself, about a father sleeping in the next tent over who had chosen, without hesitation, to ride into the one place statistically most likely to end his son's second life. He thought about 4 months of borrowed instincts teaching him to hold a sword, and a knight who'd sworn loyalty before he understood what he was swearing it to, and an inquisitor who'd looked at an unclaimed mark and chosen, against every instinct her order had trained into her, to certify hope instead of fear. Nobody in this story had ever gotten to finish it properly. Not the game's writers, shelving their raid content when the budget ran dry. Not the first Hollow King, whatever sacrifice they'd actually made, 300 years buried under doctrine that had turned their choice into a villain's legend instead of a martyr's one. Not even Micah Cole, dying in a hospital bed with 3 months turned into hours, choosing, at the very end, to spend what little he had left trying to see one small unfinished thing through to its close. "I'm not turning back," Kalen said quietly. "I've spent too long being the only person in every version of this story who never got to see how it actually ends." Illyria studied him across the firelight for a long moment, something in her expression that looked almost like the specific respect one careful person offers another when they recognize, finally, someone equally willing to walk into the unknown for the sake of actually knowing. "Then we ride at first light," she said. 5 more days, if the weather holds. And Kalen?" She paused, closing her journal fully, tucking it away inside her coat. "Whatever we find out there, whatever the choir turns out to actually be, I want you to know that regardless of how this ends, you've already done something no other mark-bearer in recorded history managed. You chose to walk toward it, with your eyes open, instead of waiting for it to come and claim you in the dark." Kalen looked north, toward mountains he couldn't yet see in the darkness but could feel, somehow, pulling at the mark on his wrist like a compass finally finding true north after years of spinning uselessly in place, and thought about all the versions of himself. The dying man, the borrowed body, the boy who'd never gotten to grow up in either life without a shadow hanging over him. Finally, for the first time since a white screen swallowed him whole, walking toward an ending instead of running from one. "Let's find out what we're actually made of," he said, and went back to his tent to try, unsuccessfully, to sleep before the sun rose on the 5th day of 9. The ash wraith came on the 6th night, and it did not come the way Kalen had braced for. He'd spent the day since leaving the ash fringe running through every fragment of monster lore his old life had ever given him. 9 years of half-remembered bestiary entries, item flavor text, the offhand comments of quest givers who'd mentioned creatures in passing without ever expecting a player to need the information for survival rather than curiosity. Ashfall Requiem had never called them ash wraiths. But the shape of the thing Illyria described, spectral, drawn to hollow-marked bloodlines, more common the closer one traveled to a site of old hollowing, matched closely enough to something the game's bestiary had called a grief wisp that Kalen had allowed himself, cautiously, a small measure of confidence. That confidence lasted exactly as long as it took for the first one to step out of the tree line. It didn't look like grief. It looked like absence given shape. A figure roughly man-height, but wrong in the way it moved, limbs articulating at angles that suggested whatever had once informed its posture had long since stopped mattering. No face, not exactly. Where a face should have been, there was only a kind of smoothness, like unworked clay, except where 2 points of faint blue-white light sat where eyes might once have been, fixed unerringly on Kalen's wrist even through his sleeve. "Contact," Ronan said, low and immediate, already between Kalen and the tree line before the word had finished leaving his mouth, sword clearing its sheath with a sound that seemed too loud in the sudden, absolute silence that had fallen over the camp. "My lord, get behind the wagons." "Wait," Illyria said, her voice tight but controlled, already moving toward her own pack rather than away from the threat. "It hasn't moved. Wraiths that haven't moved yet respond to stillness better than aggression. Every account I've read. The ash wraith moved. Not toward Ronan, who stood directly in its path with a drawn blade. Around him, in a motion too fluid for something with joints that looked so fundamentally broken, closing the distance to Kalen in a handful of strides that covered ground no human body should have crossed that quickly. Kalen had half a second to register the 2 points of light growing brighter, to feel the mark on his wrist flare suddenly, sharply cold, before instinct, his own, or borrowed, he genuinely couldn't tell anymore in moments like this, moved his body without conscious decision, twisting aside as one of the creature's elongated arms swept through the space he'd occupied a heartbeat earlier. "It's not hunting me," Kalen said, understanding arriving in the same instant as the movement that had saved him. "It's hunting the mark. It doesn't care about the rest of me at all." "That's not remotely reassuring," Ronan snapped, already pivoting, sword coming around in a strike that connected. Kalen heard the impact, saw the creature's shoulder distort under the blow, in a way that looked less like wounding and more like displacing, matter shifting rather than tearing, before reforming a half-second later as though the strike had never landed at all. "Steel doesn't work," Illyria called, voice sharp with the specific urgency of someone recalling something from a text rather than experience. "The records. Silver. It has to be silver, the same as the compact's blades." Kalen didn't have silver. Nobody in the traveling party did. There had been no reason to expect an ash wraith this far from any confirmed sighting, and every weapon they'd packed for the journey was ordinary steel, entirely useless against something that treated blades like water rather than threats. The creature turned back toward him, points of light fixed and unwavering, and Kalen understood, with the particular cold clarity of a man who had already died once and had no intention of repeating the experience carelessly, that he had approximately no time at all to solve a problem nobody in the traveling party actually had the tools to solve, except the mark itself. He didn't think it through so much as feel his way toward it, the same borrowed instinct that had taught his hands to hold a sword, now reaching for something else entirely, some deeper layer of knowledge that felt less like Kalen Corvain's dormant memory, and more like the mark's own, dim, half-formed awareness, finally surfacing at the exact moment it was needed. He pulled back his sleeve, deliberately, exposing the black fractured lines to open air for the first time since that first morning in this world, and thrust his bare wrist directly toward the creature instead of away from it. "Kalen, don't," Ronan started, and then stopped, because the ash wraith had gone suddenly, completely still, the 2 points of light fixed on the exposed mark, with an intensity that had shifted, in the space of a heartbeat, from predatory to something closer to recognition. "It's not trying to kill me," Kalen said slowly, understanding blooming through him even as he spoke it aloud, testing the theory in real time against a creature that could, quite possibly, prove him fatally wrong within seconds. "It's trying to reach the mark. Because the mark is," he hesitated, reaching for the word Illyria had used, weeks ago, in a study 300 miles south of here, "a container. And this thing, whatever it actually is underneath the shape it's wearing, I think it used to be something that belonged inside a container just like this one, before it lost whatever was holding it together." "That's a theory you're testing with your own arm," Illyria said, low and urgent, though she'd stopped reaching for a weapon and started, instead, reaching for her journal, some scholar's instinct overriding fear in a way Kalen recognized, because he'd spent 9 years cultivating that exact instinct himself. "I know." The ash wraith reached for his wrist, and Kalen, against every survival instinct his borrowed and original bodies both should have been screaming at him, let it. The touch, when it came, was cold, the specific bone-deep cold of the mark itself, amplified 100-fold, spreading up his arm in a wave that made him gasp aloud, that made Ronan surge forward with his sword raised again despite the theory, despite the stillness, some deeper protective instinct refusing to stand by and watch. But the cold didn't spread further than his shoulder. It hit some threshold, some limit Kalen couldn't name, and stopped, and the ash wraith, still touching his wrist, went utterly rigid, the 2 points of light flaring bright and then, slowly, dimming. "It's not attacking," Illyria breathed, journal forgotten in her hand. "Kalen, it's unraveling." The creature's form began to lose coherence at the edges, the clay-smooth surface of its false face rippling like water disturbed, the wrongness of its posture softening into something that looked, for just a moment, almost peaceful. And in the last instant before it dissolved entirely into a fine gray ash that drifted away on the night wind, Kalen heard, or thought he heard, the sound so faint it might have been nothing but his own overwhelmed nerves, something that resembled, distantly, a sigh of genuine relief. Then it was gone, and the clearing was silent again, and Kalen was left standing with his bare wrist exposed to the cold night air, the mark on it unchanged but for a faint warmth that hadn't been there a minute before, staring at the space where something had just, apparently, been allowed to finally stop existing on its own terms instead of being hunted into ending by someone else's blade. "What?" Ronan said, very carefully, lowering his sword with the specific, deliberate slowness of a man whose entire understanding of the last 3 minutes had just been rewritten. "In the name of every god this march prays to, was that?" They made camp early that night, nobody willing to push further with the aftermath of the encounter still raw, and Illyria spent the hours until dawn filling pages of her journal with a focused urgency Kalen hadn't seen from her since the first conversation in his father's study. Damon sat close beside his son through most of it, saying little, but present in the way he'd promised. The specific, wordless presence of a father who has just watched his child do something he cannot fully protect him from, and has chosen, instead, to simply not leave his side. "You were right," Illyria said finally, well past midnight, closing her journal and looking at Kalen with an expression that had shifted, sometime in the last several hours, from scholarly excitement into something quieter and more solemn. Not just about the container theory, about what it means for the choir itself. She hesitated. "I think the Ashwraiths aren't monsters born from the hollowing, Kalen. I think they're fragments of it. Pieces of whatever the first Hollow King's mark once contained, scattered and drifting for 3 centuries because the containment that should have held them together eventually failed. And I think what just happened tonight, what you just did, without training, without any real understanding of your own ability, was something no doctrine, no record, no prior account has ever described a mark-bearer accomplishing." "What did I do?" Kalen asked quietly, still feeling the ghost cold of the encounter lingering faint along his arm. "You didn't fight it," Illyria said. "You didn't drive it away, or destroy it, or defend yourself from it in any way the Compact's entire doctrine has ever prepared for. You let it come home." She looked at him with something that might have been awe, carefully restrained under a scholar's professional calm. "If that's true, if your mark isn't just a container for whatever's waiting at the choir, but something that can actually receive the fragments that have broken loose from it over 3 centuries, then we're not just walking toward a place that's going to kill you if you get too close." She glanced north, toward mountains that had grown, over the last 2 days, visible at last on the horizon, dark and distant and waiting. "We might be walking toward the only person in 300 years who could actually finish what the first Hollow King started, instead of merely surviving proximity to it." Kalen looked north too, feeling the mark settle quiet and warm against his wrist for the first time since it had first stirred 4 days ago, and thought about a game that had never let anyone see its ending, and a story that had, apparently, been waiting 3 centuries for someone willing to walk toward it with open hands instead of a raised blade. "3 more days," he said quietly. "3 more days," Illyria confirmed. Behind them, the fire burned low, and ahead of them, somewhere past mountains, still shrouded in distance and dark, the sundered choir waited for a story that had never finished telling itself to finally, after 300 years, find someone willing to write its last chapter. They saw it before they reached it, a bowl-shaped valley cut into the mountains like something had taken a great slow bite out of the earth centuries ago, its floor pale with ash that never seemed to blow away no matter how the wind moved through the pass above it. At the valley's center stood the ruin itself. Not a temple, not exactly, though it had clearly been built for gathering. Tiered stone rising in concentric rings around a central dais, most of it collapsed, all of it silent in the particular way of places that have been silent for so long the silence has become its own kind of architecture. "The sundered choir," Illyria said quietly, reining in her horse at the pass's edge. "Nobody stood at that dais and lived to describe it in over 40 years. Kalen felt the mark on his wrist go warm. Not the cold dread of the Ashwraith encounter, but something closer to recognition. The specific sensation of arriving somewhere his body had apparently been trying to reach since the night it first reoriented itself toward the north. He dismounted slowly, aware of his father close beside him, of Ronan's hand resting near his sword hilt without quite drawing it, of Illyria's journal already open in her hands as though she couldn't help but document even this. The last few steps of an 11-year obsession finally reaching its object. "I need to go down alone," Kalen said. "Absolutely not," Damon said immediately. "Father!" Kalen turned to him and found the words came easier than he expected, drawn up from some place that felt less like careful strategy and more like simple, unguarded honesty. "Everything Illyria's research suggests, everything the mark itself seems to be telling me, this isn't a fight I can bring you into. It's not a fight at all, I don't think. It's a conversation 300 years overdue, and I don't think it happens with an audience." He held his father's gaze, steady despite everything in him that wanted to ask for company, for safety, for anything other than walking into an ash-covered valley alone, with a curse he still didn't fully understand. "I need you to trust me, the way you decided to, that first morning, before you had any real reason to." Damon's jaw worked, old fear and new pride warring visibly across his face, and for a long moment nobody spoke. You come back, he said finally, roughly. Whatever you find down there, whatever it costs, you find a way to come back to me, Kalen. That is the one thing I am asking of you, and I am not prepared to negotiate it away. I'll try, Kalen said, because it was the only honest promise he had left to give. He walked down into the valley alone, ash rising in soft, silent clouds around each footstep, and did not look back to see whether his father was watching. He already knew he was. The dais at the ruin's center was smaller than it had looked from the pass, a simple raised platform, cracked stone worn smooth by centuries of wind, with a single object at its heart that Kalen recognized before he was close enough to properly see it, because he had seen it once before, in a broken instance, on a floor that had never finished rendering, in a life that felt, now, impossibly distant. A crown, low poly no longer, rendered here in genuine worked metal gone dark with age, sitting exactly where the object in the Dead Game's final unfinished quest had once lain, except here, in this valley, at the actual heart of a 300-year-old story, it did not carry a tooltip. It simply existed, waiting, the way it had apparently been waiting since the day the first Hollow King had set it down and walked away from whatever choice he'd made. Kalen stopped a few feet short of it. The mark on his wrist had gone fully warm now, almost hot, pulsing faintly in a rhythm that matched, he realized slowly, the beat of his own heart. "You're not what I expected," a voice said, and Kalen turned to find a figure standing at the dais' edge, who had not been there a moment before, translucent, ash-pale, wearing the shape of a man perhaps 40 years old, dressed in clothes centuries out of fashion, with eyes that held the same faint blue-white light he'd seen in the Ashwraith's hollow face, except here, contained within something that still, barely, resembled a person. "You're the first Hollow King," Kalen said, understanding arriving with a certainty that needed no confirmation. "I was a king," the figure said, something tired and old in his voice despite its lack of physical weight. "Whether I remain one, 3 centuries dissolved into fragments scattered across half a continent, is a question I've had a great deal of time to consider without ever reaching a satisfying answer." His pale eyes settled on Kalen's wrist. "You carry my mark. My containment, worn thin and patient across generations of my bloodline, waiting for someone strong enough, or foolish enough, to walk here and ask the question everyone else has spent 300 years too afraid to ask. What actually happened?" Kalen said. "The real story, not the doctrine version." The figure was quiet for a long moment, ash drifting between them in the valley's stillness. "The First Age was dying," he said finally, echoing almost exactly what Illyria had pieced together from fragmentary records, though hearing it now, from the source itself, carried a weight no archive could match. Not from war, not from any enemy anyone could raise a sword against. Something in the world's own foundation had begun to fail. Slowly, at first, and then faster. The way illness does, the way every ending eventually does, once it finally decides to stop being patient. Something that might have been the ghost of a smile crossed his translucent face. "I understand you know something of that particular pattern yourself." Kalen's breath caught. "You know about... I know that whatever wears my mark inherits, in some small measure, my own memory of what it meant to run out of time before you were ready to." The figure's form flickered, ash and light shifting together. "I made a choice, at the end, not to save the world. I was never strong enough for anything so grand, whatever the doctrine claims. I made a choice to contain the failure, instead of letting it spread unchecked. To take it into myself, piece by piece, and hold it as long as I could, so that whatever remained of the world outside this valley would have time. Not forever, just time. Enough to grow, and heal, and build something new on ground that was no longer actively failing beneath it." He looked at Kalen with something that might have been hope, carefully guarded under 3 centuries of disappointment. "I held as much as one man could hold, but I was only ever one man, and the failure was larger than any single container was ever built to hold indefinitely. Pieces broke free. Wander still, as you've already discovered, hunting for a way back to whatever whole they were once part of. The Ashwraiths. Fragments of my own failure to hold everything I promised myself I would." The king's voice had gone quiet, something like old grief threading through it. "I have watched 3 centuries of my bloodline inherit this mark, one generation at a time, hoping each new bearer might finally be strong enough to finish what I only managed to begin. Most died before they understood what they carried. A rare few, like you, lived long enough to ask the right questions. His pale eyes fixed on Kalen with sudden, focused intensity. You already did something tonight that no bearer before you has ever managed. You let one of the fragments come home instead of driving it away. Do you understand what that means? Kalen thought about the marks cold spreading up his arm and stopping, about a creature that had sighed something like relief before dissolving into ash, and understood, slowly, what the king was actually asking him. You want me to finish it, he said, not just contain the failure, actually gather it all back. All the fragments, everything that's been wandering loose for 300 years. I want you to choose, the king corrected gently, as I chose, once, knowing full well what it would cost me. I cannot promise you it costs less for you than it did for me. I cannot promise you survive gathering what I was never strong enough to finish gathering myself. I can only tell you that the world beyond this valley has had 300 years of the time I bought it, and it is not yet done needing more. He paused. And I can tell you one thing further, which I did not know myself, at the end of my own life, and which I think might matter a great deal to whoever you were before you came to wear this mark. The choosing does not have to be an ending. I made mine believing it was. A single sacrifice, complete and final, a door closing behind me forever. I have had 3 centuries, wandering half-dissolved through my own failure, to understand that I was wrong. The containing can be ongoing. A life lived alongside the burden rather than consumed entirely by it, if the one carrying it is patient enough, and lucky enough, and surrounded by people willing to help carry what a single person was never meant to hold alone. Kalen thought of his father, standing at the valley's edge, refusing to let him walk into danger without at least the choice of company. Of Ronan, swearing loyalty before he understood what it would cost. Of Illyria, chasing a truth for 11 years with nothing but stubbornness and a scholar's patience to sustain her. Of Ren Dassel, choosing to certify hope instead of fear on nothing but the evidence in front of her and the courage to trust it. He thought of a dying man who had spent his last hours finishing an unfinished story instead of grieving one, and understood, finally, standing in an ash-covered valley 300 years and one entire world away from that hospital bed, that he had never actually been given an ending back then. He had been given, instead, exactly this, a second beginning, unfinished and uncertain and entirely his own to write, one difficult choice at a time, for as long as he was lucky enough to keep choosing it. I'm not doing this alone, Kalen said quietly, reaching toward the crown at last, feeling the mark on his wrist blaze suddenly, fully warm, as though it had been waiting 300 years for exactly this decision to finally be made by someone willing to make it. Whatever it costs, however long it takes, I'm not walking away from the people who walked this far with me, and I'm not pretending this ends today just because I finally understand what it actually is. The first Hollow King's translucent form began, slowly, to soften at the edges, not dissolving into ash and grief the way the Ashwraith had, but into something quieter, something that looked, in the last moment before it faded entirely, almost like relief. Then you've already succeeded where I failed, he said, voice fading with his form. Not in strength, in company. Go carry what I could not, Kalen Corvain, and this time, do not try to carry it alone. The valley went silent, the crown sat waiting under Kalen's outstretched hand, and above the ash-pale bowl of the sundered choir, for the first time in 300 years, the wind finally began, softly, to move the dust.